everyone! As I hope you've heard, and as I mentioned in the video I posted yesterday, Santa Fe has moved classes online for the rest of the semester. This week has been mostly an effort for me to just get some material up online for you that's similar to what we would have gone over in class, but as we go forward, I'll try to make these videos more interesting visually and come up with some interactive activities that can take the place of group work, but still not add a bunch more work to your plate. What I'm thinking of doing is more discussion board based activities in place of longer reading response assignments, though there still will be a couple of those for the rest of the semester. I'll be sending out a survey on Friday asking you how you might like to see our course adapt as we move to this online existence, and I'll try to take into account some of your preferences and what might work best for everyone. You didn't sign up for an online course, and I'm suddenly trying to make this one, so I want to keep it simple, but also make sure you're able to learn in a way that works for you. So your feedback is really important to me. Now for today's focus, the critique essay. To review from last lesson, these are the goals of the critique. First, you begin with the curious stage. You ask yourself, okay, what do I want to research? What do I want to find out more about? It can be general, it can be rather specific. We've been using the zombies and ethics as kind of our sample research project for this. So then you want to consider for each source, what is it about? What are its strengths and weaknesses? How is it useful to you into the project that you could potentially write, based on these sources? And the best way to keep yourself focused to only write one paragraph per source is to establish some criteria by which you judge the source. So you can use the same criteria for each source as we'll look at today. If you think your sources are very different and it makes sense to judge them in different ways, you can set up different criteria for each one. But you want to make sure that it's clear to me in your critique paragraph that you're not just summarizing the source. You briefly summarize it, then you move on to evaluating it. So last time I showed you an example of summary statements for the critique paragraph for each one of these sources, the Walking Dead episode, the ethics website, and the article. So what we're looking at today is establishing criteria by which we could judge those sources, in which we say, okay, why is this source useful? How could it contribute to a project? So in chapter 15, we see basically an example of what we're doing with a few slight differences. If you read over chapter 15, it talks about annotated bibliographies, and that's basically the same as our critique paragraph. There's two kinds of annotated bibs, and the one called an evaluative annotation is basically what we're doing. Now, you don't have to do like you see here and cite your source in front of every paragraph. You'll just put that on the Works Cited page. But what you see here in this chapter are some examples of pretty much what we're doing in our critique paper. So you've likely noted, though, that you do have an annotated bibliography specifically due later in the semester. So you might be wondering, why are we doing it twice? Well, the critique still is a little bit different, as I'm going to go over today, but I still do think reading this chapter will help you with it. And then the official annotated bibliography assignment is going to be a part of your final paper, and it's going to cover more sources and specifically guide you in that project. Now, if you do take the research and topic from this critique paper and decide to keep exploring it for your final paper, then you probably can adapt some of your critique paragraphs for your annotated bibliography. So that's something to keep in mind. All right, so let's look at this example from chapter 15. These are two annotated bibliography entries, or as we might think of them, two critique paragraphs for two sources, right? And so this student is clearly working on a project having to do with poverty, with homelessness, or home inequity in America. And so both of her sources are dealing with different issues, but somehow she presumably is going to combine them. And we see her briefly summarize them at the start of each paragraph. So if you look at the first one, she just tells us, okay, what's the source about? The author presents the image of American poverty in 2012 with examples from various families living in poverty. The author explores the conditions that make up the new recession and suggests that people in America notice the scale of the issue and take action to solve it. So there we've got a short summary, captures the main idea of the article. Now you have to critique it, right? This person has set up 3 criteria that they found probably useful for their particular project, because these sources are going to go towards a paper that they're writing. So they're judging all of their sources the same way. You don't necessarily have to do that. We'll look at, okay, depending upon your source, what does it make sense to critique it, I guess, according to. But in this case, these things work pretty well for our student. So Kelly, the student, is evaluating her sources according to degree of advocacy, credibility, and reliability. So clearly her paper must have some sort of emphasis upon actual activism and advocacy for changes, in connection to poverty epidemics. So in each of her articles, she's looking to see, do they have recommendations for advocacy, actions? And so she's making sure that that is there. She also is looking for credibility, right? Who is this author? Can we trust them on this topic? And then she's looking for reliability of the magazine that her sources are published in, right? So those are the criteria that she decided were useful. Those could be criteria you use, but I will encourage you to maybe cast your net a little bit broader, because your project is slightly different than this one. So we'll look at examples today of what this zombie, critique, the example I've been using, might look like. So the important thing for this critique essay is that you start with some idea of what you want these sources to help you understand better. And it can be as vague as, who has written about vampires? What do they have to say about them? It could be, what kind of interpretations are out there about why zombies are so popular? It could be, what kind of analyses are people doing of Get Out, Frankenstein, Beauty and the Beast, the show You, the game The Witcher? Anything where you're like, oh, I like that thing. I'm interested in that thing. What are people saying about it? That is fine, right? You can be that general at this point and just see what you discover. Or maybe you have a specific idea in mind, like the model that we've been using, where you say, basically, I watched an episode of The Walking Dead. I observed a particular theme. I want to see what kind of sources are out there that would help me explore it, which in this case is how humans, their behavior, their ethics is affected, in survival mode, essentially. So have a starting point. If you're stuck, let me know. But the important thing right now is to start researching, and then you'll be able to get to the point of critiquing your sources. And you might be surprised by some of the places that your research goes. This is a curiosity process, not an argument writing process, not until your final paper. So as you research, just kind of see what's out there. For instance, I found an academic article that dealt with the impact of trauma and changing ethics as characters struggle to survive in The Walking Dead. And because I found that article, I thought it might be useful to find a source that helps me understand ethics better. So bam, I had 3 sources: The Walking Dead, the trauma article, and the ethics website. And then I go from there. So the sources you use for this project are entirely up to you. You don't have to end up making an argument with them. Don't drive yourself crazy trying to find 3 amazing sources that fit perfectly together. You're simply experimenting with research, settling upon 3 sources that interest you, and then you read them, evaluate their usefulness, and speculate on what kind of paper you could write if you were using those sources, just like you did for the brief response this week. Now, a point of clarification. To critique is to evaluate something. So you're going to see that I use those words interchangeably. Hopefully that's not confusing. But basically, in this course, I'm supposed to have you write a critique paper. But our book uses the word evaluation in chapter 16, but they basically mean the same thing. So if you look at chapter 16, I think that's also going to be helpful. They give you an example of a movie review that someone has written. And so you can see that you can use sources in a paper that aren't just academic articles. So what I want to look at now is how would we critique that episode of The Walking Dead for this example critique paper? And what kind of paragraph would you include if one of your sources is a movie, a TV show, a book, a video game, something like that, instead of a more traditional article? So I've broken this up into bullet points, but technically this is meant to be just like one really long paragraph. Yours doesn't necessarily need to be that long. You should recognize the first part because I showed you that in the last lecture. This is my summary, right? Where in just a couple sentences, I tell my reader what is my source about. In this case, it's a brief plot summary. Then I'm going to get into my critique. So I have to decide, sometimes you decide before you read your source or watch your source what you want it to do well. Sometimes you reflect upon it afterwards and you say, okay, these are the things that stuck out to me. In my critique paragraph, I'm going to focus on those, as long as you have focal points. So I chose to think about my source's relevancy. Why does it matter? And then I sought to find evidence, right? Does it have good evidence for whatever, I think the point is, right? In this case, I've already begun to develop an argument in my head, which you don't have to necessarily. So to me, it's relevant, this episode, because it illustrates people processing trauma and figuring out their ethics. And I have evidence to show it, things that I observed in the episode. So at the end of this paragraph, I have sort of a mini conclusion. Your criteria paragraph doesn't have to necessarily do that. It can be shorter. But basically, you want a brief summary, and then 2 to 3 criteria. You can see that 2 gives you plenty to work with, by which you judge the usefulness and value of your source. And then you move on to the next source. So let's take a look here. First, I judge the relevancy of my source. While there is a long history of zombie movies and video games, The Walking Dead is the first major television series that, through the senseless monster of the zombie, explores humanity quite deeply, and its popularity and longevity makes it worth going back to examine its first episode. So I've established why somebody would even look at this source for meaning. It does have relevancy to pop culture, to humanity. But then I go a little bit into more detail for my next criterion, which is evidence. Does this episode, just like an article, provide evidence of its point? So if the point of this first episode, as I've interpreted it, is to see, okay, how do ethics and human behavior change or not change in the zombie apocalypse, then what does this episode do to support a certain interpretation? So I take a look here, and you run the risk of doing just too much summary. So you want to make sure that whatever detail you provide here, you tell your reader like why it matters, basically. So this is what I noted as the strength of the episode's evidence or detail. So here, despite Rick's confusion at a dangerous new world, we initially see a rather hopeful depiction of human behavior. The Morgans take Rick in, treat his wounds, and share their dinner table with him, despite the danger he could present them. From their initial fear that he might turn into a zombie, to the son's theory that Rick could be a criminal. Rick returns their kindness by sharing police resources, hot water, which is great, and guns, the latter definitely an important commodity. So this reciprocal behavior is based on family values and social structures. Rick is a man of the law who wants to help others. The Morgans have tragically lost a family member, but haven't become so warped by grief that they would treat everyone else as a threat, right? So I think that this episode does a good job at giving me evidence of the kind of themes that this show is going to address. And then I do a little bit of a conclusion sentence, and I say, looking forward, because I've watched other elements of the show, that this episode sets up a measure by which future character interactions will be measured. Oops, that's kind of redundant. Will all characters be as trustworthy or as kind? Will all of them work together cooperatively? What place will ethics have as the show digs deeper into, this world of chaos, right? So that is what a sample critique paragraph would look like for the episode. I summarize it briefly. I use 2 criteria and explain whether or not I think this source is useful in exploring what I want to explore. So that's going to look a little bit different for everybody. So now that I know what I think is interesting about my first source, that can influence the kind of research I want to keep doing, and it helps me find other sources that could help me talk about what I think The Walking Dead is doing as a show. So we've seen other authors do that this semester. We've read a number of researched analyses, which are good sources to be investigating, because that's what your final paper is basically going to look like. So we had Peter H. Brothers, who was initially intrigued by Godzilla and its history. And so then he researched historical context that taught him about Japanese post-World War II trauma. And he also, as someone who is, in film studies, he used some of his knowledge, which we might have to research, to help him analyze films. In Stephen T. Asma's article, he gives an overview of previous trends in monster stories, so likely his interest grew out of there. And then as an ethics professor, he started to seek connections, and then he conducted research to help him show that we gravitate towards stories about monsters to help us hone our moral imaginations. His research sources included the concept of moral imagination, which he learned from another author, and studying contemporary events, like the case of the man who was shot in the cafe. We've also got Chuck Klosterman, who we read not that long ago, and so surely at some point, he just kind of observed modern life feels a lot like the undead. And so then he found sources, and he talked to people that reflected on the mundane, zombie-like tasks of modern life. And then, as I mentioned in class, it would have been maybe helpful and interesting if one of his other sources had been something like the movie Shaun of the Dead, because it would have helped him synthesize his sources really well. Now, you don't actually have to write an essay like theirs yet. That's the final paper. Right now, for the critique assignment, you're doing the initial work of picking a topic, a monster, an idea, a particular show, or other piece of media, whatever, and then doing some initial research and thinking about how that research is useful. 3 sources of your choosing. Anything at all related to the course themes is fair game, and that can be broadly interpreted. So if you want to run an idea by me, send me an email. I'm going to be pretty flexible about topics as you're working on your own. So let's switch back. Let's take a look at the article Surviving the Zombie Apocalypse, Trauma and Transformation in AMC's The Walking Dead. Now, this essay is a pretty good example of the kind of thing you're going to write for your final essay project for this class. Now, this is 12 pages. Yours is going to be more like 6 unless you really get into it. So we might almost think of the subsections in this essay as essays with their own focus that would be more like the length of what we would do. So we've got a world of trauma, moral injury, warfare, betrayal, and the negation of the ethical self, And then we have resilience and transformation. Who do people become at the end of the world? This essay is well researched and analytical in its argument. It's not a matter of taking a topic that you can argue for or against, which is what maybe many of your past argument paper assignments might have been. Here the goal is to choose an analytical tool to help you examine, interpret, and make an argument about something. So the essays that we read for the rest of the semester will help us to see how to do that for your final paper. For the critique essay, you're basically doing the research and thinking that would come before writing a paper like that one. So this writer, George Hagman, uses trauma theory in research, as well as some ethical and psychoanalytical sources to help support his interpretation of The Walking Dead's cultural relevance and meaning. So one of the criteria you could use for your critique paragraph for a source like this one might be, how well does this source help me analyze and think deeper about my topic? And then you would tell your reader, how well does this source do with that? Or, like I used in The Walking Dead, you could ask, does this source have good evidence for its meaning, for its theme, or for its argument? That would be a perfectly good criterion to use if you were writing about an article like this one. So his article covers a lot of ground when it comes to the show. It seeks to highlight the ways in which a show about zombies actually meditates on some pretty serious topics. I'd love to take the time to talk about this article in more detail because I think it raises some really fascinating ways of looking at The Walking Dead and humanity, but you probably don't want an hour-long lecture video, so I'm thinking maybe later in the semester we might come back to this as an example of how to write an argumentative, well-researched analysis, because I think there is a lot we can learn from it. But for now, let's break down a few of the major ideas because we might want to talk about them in a critique paragraph. So first, Hagman offers a plot rundown for readers, outlining what the show is about and some of the major events that have inspired his analysis of trauma, ethics, and transformation. His point about a lot of our traditional social structures crumbling in a world like this one is important. No government, no police, broken families, a lot of the things we rely on to guide our behavior and our ethical decision making. That kind of disarray, Hagen demonstrates in his article, only increases as the show goes on, and new, sometimes dangerous kinds of social groups come to replace those that have been lost, what he calls monstrous new organizing groupings of survivors. For example, in a later season, Rick and some of his group travel to a place called Terminus, which they've heard is a safe utopia, and perhaps it even was once. But when the people at Terminus were betrayed by others, they hardened and twisted until they were luring groups of people in like Rick to take advantage of and actually, spoiler, cannibalize. So in this Walking Dead world, who can you trust? Do you throw your ethics out the window when it seems like they don't fit anymore? Or do you adapt somehow, more positively? Another key point that Hagman explores is how trauma impacts behavior and ethics, and he's done some excellent research to guide his interpretations of the show. Much like the third source I have us use for this mock project was only about ethics, not about zombies, he has some sources that are just about trauma and psychology, even trauma and war, and not about zombies. It becomes his job to think about those sources and make the connections to The Walking Dead. So that leads us to his idea, or rather, an idea he gained from his research called moral injury, which is a concept that works really well with The Walking Dead. So from his research, he has found this concept of moral injury. He defines it, paraphrases the research, lets us know that what this means is the loss of the sense of everyday certainty, how it affects one's ethics. Particularly the idea comes from talking about people who are in combat situations. But what is the war against zombies except for combat? Lots of it. And so it seems that Hagman is able to draw some useful connections between moral injury research and the kind of project he is working on. So we have these highlighted sections here that you can see the connection, I think. Moral injury deteriorates character, ideals, ambitions, attachment. It destroys the capacity to trust, makes you then fear other people, strike first before they hurt you. And Hagman recognizes that actually makes sense as a survival strategy when you are encountering such extreme circumstances, and yet it might also feel like a betrayal of who you are. As he notes, Rick Grimes struggles with how he feels about the actions he has to take, right, especially early on in the show. So that's something that becomes kind of psychologically traumatic for him. So moving on from, the darker stuff, because here's a show that maybe offers some hope too. So we get past the nihilism and the destructive nature of a lot of the elements of the show, and Hagman speculates that there might be a reason why viewers are drawn to this show, and that the characters in it might actually emerge stronger as a result of all the trauma and moral injury. So in the resilience and transformation section, Hagman observes how some of the characters grow through their shared trauma and actually build better relationships. The article draws upon research from reputable sources, which might be something that we use as a criterion in the critique paragraph. So he draws upon the American Psychological Association here, who describe resilience as the process of adapting in the face of adversity, trauma, or significant sources of stress. And then Hagman applies that research to his analysis of the characters of the show, noting how Rick and Daryl bond over the seasons. At the start of the show, Daryl is not so fond of Rick or anyone, particularly because of Rick and the first group's involvement in the loss of his actual brother. And yet, after facing danger together, committing acts for survival that, sometimes are disturbing to them, Rick and Daryl are able to bond and build each other up. So we get to a point in the show when Daryl is able to say to Rick, "You're back with us now. That's everything. You're my brother." So there are things still worth fighting for in this world and that add value to life. And then finally, Hagman takes all of this and he wonders, what does this have to do with the viewer? What do we get out of this? So he applies some of these theories, some of this research, to real life. And it actually might be pretty relatable right now. He notes that, quote, if we suddenly found ourselves transported for real into the world of The Walking Dead, we would be terrified, panicked, and desperate to escape. But we might still be able to identify from our living rooms with the idea of struggle, trauma, and resilience, and the show offers, as he says, a fantasy of trauma and an escape from trauma. The important part being that it's not just a gratuitous display of suffering, but that the show also demonstrates a process of working through that suffering with the characters once you grow attached to them, and as he says, escaping and healing and eventually achieving a feeling of confidence and acceptance. So as Hagman points out, for these characters, that's often a short-lived state of being, but for us it might not be. Hagman argues that the weekly dose of horror, danger, survival, and emotional struggle is just the right medicine to release tension, quiet our fears, and assure us that however much we might fear life and what it has in store for us, it could be worse. And I would add it can be good. The way people unite together and help each other in times of need. So maybe right now, in our own chaos and uncertainty, some of you might find comfort in funny movies, and others might seek out a stress release in horror and suspense. Netflix has been showing me that apocalypse, zombie, suspense, those films are popular right now. So maybe Hagman is onto something. We all need our coping mechanisms and something that helps us believe that resilience is possible and hope can remain, while also releasing some stress by vicariously sharing in the character's experience instead of dwelling on our own. Maybe that is good medicine. Your mileage may vary. I watched a horror movie last night, but now that I saw Disney Plus is making Frozen 2 available, I'm going to watch that too. So do what works for you. Now, back to thinking about this source as a part of a critique paper. You would want to come up with criteria by which you could judge it, and then ultimately you're thinking about what kind of paper it could help you write. A possibility for a final paper would be to use this source and others to analyze an episode or episodes more deeply, going beyond or in different directions than this article. I could use it as a jumping off point and maybe explore my own interpretation of The Walking Dead, maybe one that's less nihilistic. I might argue that ethical thinking is still practiced and rewarded throughout the series, which I would have to provide evidence of, and that the characters do find positive ways to cope with trauma, and maybe I argue more about how this clearly helps viewers, so I could expand on something that this article says. If I turned this into a larger project, I could also use the Ethics, a general introduction webpage, as just something to help guide me into deeper research about particular modes of ethics that could be applicable, such as subjectivism. For a longer paper, I'd have to find more detailed sources about subjectivism to help me analyze, say, ethics in a zombie apocalypse. But I have a lot of options here, and I just kind of want to give you a sense, even though we're not on the final paper yet, that if the critique is sort of practice for that, be thinking about what a final paper might look like. So for a larger project, I could also look back at Chuck Klosterman's essay, My Zombie Myself, Why Modern Life Feels Rather Undead. I could say, if he's right about the idea that we watch zombie media because we relate to it, I might say, okay, sure, but I have my own argument about how we relate to it. And I develop my own idea about how characters dealing with uncertainty and trauma is something we can relate to, even if our lives explore that, hopefully, on a smaller scale. So that's one possibility, and it all comes from doing initial research and thinking and finding my own path. That's the direction we'll be exploring in our next essay. For now, the critique paper is the research, evaluating sources, and brainstorming process, which is an important stage that can be more difficult than we think. So all of that said, what would a critique paragraph look like for this source, Surviving the Zombie Apocalypse? I can't talk about everything from the article. That's not my job in my critique paper. So let's take a look at what we do have here. So first I have the summary, and I'll let you read that on your own, but my goal there is to give a brief picture of what I think Hagman's article is arguing. And then I have two criteria that I'm going to judge the article by. And one of them is relevancy, like why does this article matter? And then how well does this article, how strong is its argument? How well does it support the argument? So first point, In a world in which we are exposed to global news 24/7, we're very aware of how chaotic and painful modern life can be, even when we're not affected personally. The idea that experiencing these things at a larger scale in a fantasy world might help us cope is an intriguing one, and it might be one explanation for why The Walking Dead is still going, now in its 10th season. We watch the show for the characters, for the study of humanity, and not just to see brain-eating zombies, right? So that is part of Hagman's argument, that this is a fantasy world that helps us cope in some ways with modern life. And so I've basically indicated here that, yeah, that seems relevant, that seems intriguing, I approve, basically. And then the final criterion that I use is the strength of his argument. And so here I tell you what I think works, right? So this is a positive critique. You can definitely end up concluding that your source isn't very good. That's part of the process too. So don't feel like you have to pick a new source if you find a bad one. Go with that too, right? And just, give us your justification for it. So for my final criterion, I say Hagman supports his interpretation of the show with relevant and insightful psychological research, explaining how extreme situations and trauma affect ethical behavior and threaten trusted values, so that a real comparison can be drawn between things we know of, like PTSD, and a show like The Walking Dead, in which pretty much everybody is living through new trauma while still coping with the old, kind of constant state of PTSD. Hagman's analysis highlights the complexity of the show and how he pays attention to character growth, heavy subject matter, and audience reception. So here I've made a judgment. I've evaluated. I've said he has good research, his interpretation is sound and interesting, and he's able to make important connections, and here are the ones that I thought were interesting and valuable. So that's what your critique paragraph does. Briefly summarizes, picks 2 things that you have noticed that are good or bad, useful or interesting, the part where you're doing more than just summarizing, right? So each critique paragraph should have 2 to 3 criteria that help you evaluate the effectiveness or the usefulness of your sources. So I've decided ultimately to not do an example for the ethics source, just to cut down on the video length a little bit, but I'll send it and these other paragraphs to you in a Word document so you have them as a reference. But the final part of the critique essay is your synthesis paragraph. Like I said, this is basically what you did for the brief response homework. After you've written all of your critique paragraphs, you look over them and you say, okay, how do these sources connect to each other? How might they work together? If, at this point, this is something you can still be heading back to the readings for. If you take a look at the second half of chapter 15, it describes what we call a review of scholarly literature. In fact, that section of the book is actually about zombies, which I didn't even plan. It gives an overview of some of the research out there about zombies as an academic topic. And so that scholarly review is basically the same thing we're doing for the synthesis, just a bit shorter. So the synthesis paragraph in your critique essay is the place where you draw the connections that, if you look on page 201 in the book, you can see that the goal is ultimately to think about your 3 sources together, draw connections between them, and then something extra that I'm asking you to do is to state what kind of paper would these sources help you write, theoretically. It's a brainstorming phase. So this is what you did in the homework, and I'm going to share an example with you actually from Nicole in section 62. So periodically throughout the rest of the semester, I might sometimes ask you, hey, that's a good example. Can I share it with the class? So I'll always ask your permission. Nicole has given the go-ahead. So let's take a look at her paragraph that she wrote for the brief response, which is a synthesis paragraph. This is what would come at the end of your critique paper. So she writes, the articles Ethics, A General Introduction, and Surviving the Zombie Apocalypse, Trauma and Transformation in AMC's The Walking Dead, as well as the first episode of Season 1 of The Walking Dead, can be related by their ethical matters. Aided by these sources, you could explore the fragility of ethics based on their dependence to a sense of normality. Though they are often treated as such, AMC's series demonstrates a scenario in which ethics are not a universal truth, but rather subject to the environment and circumstances that erect them. The concepts of what is right and wrong change greatly when survival is the priority. Additionally, if a person has undergone severe trauma, it's possible that their perceptions become distorted, resulting in what Surviving the Zombie Apocalypse calls a moral injury. These claims could be supported by both articles and seen in the episode. So that's a really great example of what a synthesis does. It says, now that I've read my sources, I've critiqued them individually, what could they do together? What are the connections between them? And you don't need to feel like you have like a rock solid argument in one paragraph. That's okay. You're writing about what could I theoretically do with these sources. And then if you wanted to, in your final paper, you could do it. But you don't have to. You could move on to something else. So this has been an example of critiquing and synthesizing 3 sources for a critique paper. Now it's time to think about your critique paper, if you haven't already. It's important to review the assignment instructions on Canvas. Keep in mind that the draft of this essay is due March 31st. We'll conduct peer review online, and I'll walk you through how to do that closer to then. And then your final copy is due April 3rd. So if you haven't started brainstorming about a topic yet, you definitely want to do that so that you can start researching. Next week, we're going to continue talking about this process. And, if at any point you're stuck for ideas, you hit a roadblock, let me know. So the first thing, once you've got a topic idea in mind, even if it's as simple as typing in zombies and seeing what comes up, research is where we want to be going at this point. So how do you get started with your research? I'm going to talk more about that next week, but in the description of this video, I've linked to some really good Santa Fe videos to get you started. They guide you through their resources and how you can use them to conduct research. Next week, we'll go through those in more detail. Now, my expectation at this point is that you're going to start researching for the critique if you haven't already. Find your sources, and then next week we'll talk about the assigned readings, and also the rest of the semester we're going to be focusing on how to write a well-researched analytical argument. And the essays that we read from now on are going to serve as examples. The essays we've read so far have all been examples of how to write the kind of paper you're going to do for your final paper. I'm going to post next week's readings and assignments tomorrow, Friday, and I'll send out a Canvas message when those are up. And as I've said before, I'm going to try to post all of the video lectures for next week by Monday or over the weekend. I've also decided that after this week, I'm going to give you until Sunday for all of the week's assignments. That way you can work at your own pace. Obviously, turn in stuff earlier if you want, but I really do want to give you as much flexibility as I can while still making sure we keep learning and we keep building each week on what we're learning. The survey I'm going to send out tomorrow will deal with some technical things, but also ask you to consider a few possibilities for readings or screenings for the rest of the semester. So please do respond and have your say. And well, I guess that's it for the day. So here's my social distancing message. Either don't go out or have some kind of outfit set up to keep people 6 feet away from you. And keep calm. Do your research for a paper. Watch Netflix or whatever. Video chat with people. I think that really helps you, break up any loneliness or isolation you might be feeling. And stay safe. So remember that your brief response and discussion board posts are due by the end of the day Friday, though next week I'll start making things due Sunday. But if you do need more time this week, let me know and I'll work with you. All right, thanks everybody. Let me know if you have questions, and I will talk to you via video next week.